All right, today we are diving into one of history's great what-ifs. It's a story packed with brutal conquest, a shocking failure, and honestly, one of the most audacious acts of political spin you will ever hear about. We're talking about Napoleon Bonaparte's campaign in Syria, a total disaster that he somehow managed to twist into a personal triumph. And that right there is the big question, isn't it? How does that even happen? In 1799, Napoleon leads his army straight into a meat grinder, suffers his first real major defeat, and then straight up abandons his men. And yet, he sails back to France a hero. So how did he pull it off? Well, the answer is a masterclass in controlling the story. A story that begins with a very, very desperate gamble. So let's set the scene. It's early 1799. Napoleon's grand adventure in Egypt is not going great. His entire fleet has been destroyed by the British, which means he's basically cut off from France. To make things worse, the Ottoman Empire is putting together two gigantic armies to come and wipe him out. So instead of sitting there and waiting to be crushed, Napoleon decides to do what he does best, go on the attack. He's going to march into Syria and hit the first Ottoman army before it's ready. But right from the get-go, things started to go wrong. He marches 13,000 men, and that's all he could spare, into the Sinai Desert. The conditions were absolutely brutal. The army immediately gets bogged down at a fortress called El Arish in this unexpected 11-day siege. It cost him time and men he really couldn't afford to lose. They did get some relief and much-needed supplies in Gaza, but the bloody, grinding tone for this whole campaign was already set. From Gaza, the army moves up the coast to the city of Jaffa. Now, Napoleon, he's hoping to avoid a really costly fight, so he sends a messenger to demand their surrender. While the Ottoman defenders, they had a different idea. They responded by cutting off the messenger's head and sticking it on the city walls for everyone to see. This act of defiance pretty much sealed the city's fate, and you can bet absolutely enraged the French soldiers. So when the French finally broke through the walls, they unleashed 24 hours of just sheer terror on the city. We're talking an indiscriminate massacre of soldiers and civilians. This account from an eyewitness gives you just a small glimpse of the brutality. It was absolute chaos, slaughter, and looting on a horrific scale. And the horror didn't stop there. After the city fell, Napoleon had a new problem: 3,000 Ottoman prisoners. His logic here was just ice cold and ruthless. He didn't have the food to feed them, and he sure didn't have the spare troops to guard them. Plus, he argued, some of them were guys from El Arish who'd promised not to fight again. So over 3 days, he had them all march to the beach and systematically shot or bayoneted. And you know, if you thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. Bubonic plague suddenly tears through the French army. Now, Napoleon famously visited the sick to try and boost morale, an act his propaganda artists later made legendary, but it was still another devastating blow to his forces. So now the army is suffering from battle, from massacre, and now from disease as they march on. Their main objective was next, the ancient fortress city of Acre. This was the key to Syria. If Napoleon could take Acre, he'd cripple the Ottoman presence in the whole region. But Acre, and its absolutely ruthless ruler Ahmed Pasha al-Jazar, a man literally known as the Butcher, were not going to be an easy prize. So the task facing Napoleon was, well, almost impossible. Get this. His crucial siege cannons, the big guns he needed to break the walls, had been captured at sea by the British. And what did the British do? They gave them to the defenders of Acre. So Napoleon is left with a few small field guns going up against 250 cannons, while British ships are resupplying the city and his own army is sick with plague. It was a complete and total mismatch. You have to remember, up to this point, Napoleon's career was just one string of impossible victories after another. People thought he was invincible. But right here, at the ancient walls of Acre, all of that was about to change. His unstoppable momentum was about to crash headfirst into an immovable object, commanded by the Butcher, an old French classmate of his, and a swashbuckling British admiral named Sir Sidney Smith. While the siege of Acre was grinding to a halt, that massive Ottoman relief army, we're talking tens of thousands of soldiers, finally showed up to attack the French from behind. To deal with this massive threat, Napoleon could only spare a tiny fraction of his men. The odds were just staggering. His general, Kleber, found himself with just 1,500 soldiers, completely surrounded by a force of 35,000. And yet, in what can only be described as a tactical miracle, the French won. Kleber's men formed into squares and just held off the enemy for 10 straight hours until Napoleon showed up with reinforcements. He slammed into the Ottoman rear, causing mass panic, and the huge army just disintegrated. It was a stunning, brilliant victory that really should have sealed Acre's fate. But it didn't. Back at Acre, nothing changed. The defenders, backed by the British, were just too strong, and the walls were too thick. After 2 grueling months and 8 separate bloody assaults, Napoleon had to accept the unthinkable. He had been beaten. For the very first time in his career, he ordered a retreat. So let's be clear, the Syrian campaign was an objective failure. But Napoleon was not about to let a little thing like defeat define the story. The long, brutal march back to Egypt, as horrific as it was, would actually set the stage for one of the most incredible reversals of fortune in his entire life. The 300-mile retreat was a living nightmare. The heat was scorching, water was almost impossible to find, and morale was at rock bottom. Back in Jaffa, Napoleon made another one of his infamous, controversial decisions. He ordered doctors to euthanize about 50 of his own plague-stricken soldiers, arguing it was a mercy killing to keep them from being captured and tortured. Finally, on June 14th, the shattered remains of his army staggered back into Cairo. But there was zero time to rest. That second Ottoman army had finally landed at Abukir. Napoleon saw his chance. He raced his men to the coast and launched a lightning-fast attack, pinning the Ottomans with their backs to the sea. In just a few hours, he completely annihilated their entire force. Thousands were shot, cut down, or drowned as they tried to swim back to their ships. The victory at Abukir was total. It was spectacular, and it gave Napoleon the opening he needed. He could now frame the entire expedition as a huge success. He destroyed both invading armies, right? Now, hearing there was political chaos back in France, he saw his chance. He decided to abandon his army in Egypt and secretly sail home to seize power for himself. Yeah. Napoleon's departure was not well received by the guys he left behind. This quote from General Kleber, the man Napoleon dumped the command on, pretty much sums up how betrayed they felt. The army was completely abandoned, and they knew it. Kleber himself would be assassinated the next year, and the rest of the French army finally surrendered to the British in 1801. But the campaign did have one lasting and completely accidental positive outcome. Shortly before he left, some of Napoleon's soldiers dug up this peculiar-looking stone slab near a town called Rosetta. It had the same message written on it in 3 different scripts. This, of course, was the Rosetta Stone, the key that would finally unlock the thousands of years of secrets hidden in Egyptian hieroglyphs. So when you really look at the legacy, it's just incredibly complicated. Militarily, it was a disaster for France, no question. But for Napoleon himself, it was a propaganda masterpiece. And scientifically, thanks to the Rosetta Stone and all the scholars he brought with him, it was a monumental success that literally gave birth to the entire field of Egyptology. Which brings us right back to our original question. The Syrian campaign was a bloody failure, full stop. But Napoleon's stunning victory at Abukir and his absolute mastery of propaganda allowed him to return to France as a conquering hero, paving his way to become emperor. It really makes you wonder, in the grand scheme of things, what really matters more? What actually happened, or the powerful story that survives?